starts with a bed. An old, splintered frame of oak, handmade before the turn of the century, its legs uneven, its posts carved by a man who could neither read nor write. The mattress was stuffed with corn husks and horsehair, later replaced with rags, and later still just flattened wool. 7 generations slept there. Not in a poetic sense. Literally, one bed passed from hand to hand, house to house, body to body. Every child was conceived in it. Every old man died in it. Locals said the bed held their scent, that if you walked into that house on a summer night, the air smelled like sweat, mildew, and something older, something animal. The bed belonged to the Whittakers of the Ozarks. Not the same Whittakers known from West Virginia. These were older, quieter, buried deeper in the mountains of northern Arkansas. They lived in a hollow so isolated that maps stopped marking the road half a century ago. They called it Widow's Creek, though no one could recall a widow ever living there. For 7 generations, the Whittakers married their cousins. Sometimes first cousins, sometimes double cousins. When the county clerk refused to sign their licenses, they stopped registering marriages altogether. But the children came anyway, thin, pale, eyes too far apart, with the same slack-jawed smile that ran through the bloodline like a curse. People in nearby towns told stories. They said the Whittakers didn't talk right, that they barked more than spoke, that their laughter didn't sound human. Hunters said they could hear it in the fog, a kind of giggling that came from the trees. But few ever went up Widow's Creek after dark. Old-timers remember when the mailman used to drive that route. He'd toss a sack of letters at the foot of the hill and never leave his truck running while he waited. Once, in the late 1940s, he said a boy came down to fetch the bag. Barefoot, hair like straw, wearing nothing but an old flour sack tied with string. The boy looked up at him with those wide, unblinking eyes and said, "Ma says thank you." The mailman quit the next week. But the Whittakers didn't disappear. They just sank deeper. The world moved on. Highways were built, power lines stretched over the hills, and somehow the Whittakers remained in that hollow, untouched by all of it. The land grew quieter, the houses smaller, and the bed stayed where it had always been. No one knows who built it first. Some say it came with the original settler, a man named Ephraim Whittaker, who carved his name into the wood in 1847. Others think it predates even him, a relic left behind by an earlier family that vanished in the cholera years. Whatever the truth, every Whittaker child was born on that same mattress. And that's where the story begins to twist. In the late 1970s, a county social worker named Helen Graves tried to reach them. She was new to the job, idealistic, curious. She'd heard rumors of children up there who'd never been to school, of people who'd never seen a doctor. So one spring morning, she drove her state-issued car as far as the gravel would take her, then walked the rest of the way up the mountain. When she came back down 3 hours later, she was silent. Her supervisor said she never filed the report, never wrote a word. 2 weeks later, she requested a transfer to another county. Years later, when asked about it, she said only this: they didn't seem to know what year it was. Or maybe they just didn't care. Locals began to whisper that she'd seen the bed. It was around that time that the family stopped appearing altogether. No one saw them at the trading post anymore. No more footprints at the edge of the creek. Just silence. The houses decayed. Roofs caved in. The fields went wild. Hunters avoided the area. When one or two who dared to venture close claimed they saw movement in the windows, they described faces that didn't quite look real. Pale, ghostly, with eyes that seemed to shine even in daylight. By the time the county finally sent a cleanup crew in the early 2000s, the Whittakers were gone. All that was left was a sagging cabin and the bed. Still intact. Still in the same corner of the same room, as if waiting. They said the floor around it was worn smooth, not just from footsteps, but from years of something heavier, rhythmic. The smell was unbearable. The bed itself had blackened with age, its frame carved with initials, hundreds of them, like generations leaving their mark on a tombstone. When they pulled the mattress apart, they found bones inside. Not human, animal bones mostly, but mixed with locks of hair, old ribbons, fragments of baby clothes. No one claimed to know why. A local historian tried to trace the family line back through census records, but it broke down around 1890. Names repeated over and over: Ephraim, Mary, Ruth, Ezekiel, the same ones appearing for decades, sometimes with dates that didn't add up. It was as though time folded in on itself up there, looping generation after generation in the same narrow valley, under the same roof, in that same bed. And maybe that's what it was. A loop, a curse of blood and isolation. Some say inbreeding was just a symptom, not the disease itself. The real sickness was loneliness, a kind of genetic solitude that stretched over a century. The Whittakers didn't choose their fate. They were born into it, trapped by geography, by poverty, by tradition. The bed was the anchor that held them there, a monument to something America forgot existed. Even now, people who grew up near Widow's Creek say you can feel it if you hike too far past the old mine road. The air goes still. The birds stop singing. And sometimes, if you listen close, you can hear the creak of wood, slow and steady, like a rocking chair in an empty room. Or maybe it's the bed, waiting for someone else to lie down, because no one ever burned it. The county men left it there, said it was too heavy to move, too rotten to save. So they sealed the cabin and walked away. But the forest took it back. And somewhere beneath the vines and the dust, the bed remains, the last piece of the most inbred clan of the Ozarks. But that's just the surface. The whispers, the folklore, the truth, as always, is darker, and much closer than anyone realizes. Because when I started tracing the Whittaker line myself, I found something the old historians missed. They didn't die out. At least not all of them. One branch left Widow's Creek in 1932, and they didn't go far. Just across the border into Missouri, where they changed their name. And if you follow the trail of birth certificates, school records, and property deeds long enough, you end up at a single address. A small house outside Springfield. And someone still lives there. Someone who carries that blood. And when I went there, when I saw what was inside, I understood why the bed was never burned. It wasn't finished. The woman who opened the door looked like anyone you'd pass in a grocery store. Middle-aged, kind eyes, soft voice. She said her name was Ruth. The name hit me immediately, one of the same ones that kept reappearing in the family records. She smiled when I asked if she had any family from Arkansas. A few, she said, but we don't talk much. Her living room was spotless, almost too spotless. Plastic over the furniture, an old wall clock ticking a little too loud. On a side table sat a framed photograph, black and white, worn thin around the edges. I asked if I could take a look. She hesitated, then nodded. It was the Whittaker house. I knew it instantly. The same sagging porch, the same split-rail fence, the same barren trees behind it. And standing in front, a cluster of people all looking at the camera. Their eyes were wrong. Wide, glassy, their expressions vacant. In the middle was a young woman holding a baby. The woman looked exactly like Ruth. I think that's my great-grandmother, she said quietly. They say she lived up in the hills. Never came down. I asked her if she'd ever been there. Her face went still. No, but sometimes I dream about it. I see the house, the bed. I don't know how I know what it looks like, but I do. The air in the room seemed to tighten. I could feel the pulse in my neck. There was something about the way she said bed that made me want to leave. But before I could speak, she asked me a question. Do you believe places can remember things? It's not the kind of question you expect from a stranger. She said it like someone confessing, not asking. I told her that maybe they could, that would hold sound, that stone holds heat, that memory leaves residue. She smiled again, but this time it was smaller. Sometimes at night, she said, I can hear something moving in the walls, not mice, slower than that, like breathing. I never saw her again. A few weeks later, I called the number she'd given me. Disconnected. When I tried the address again, the house was empty. Curtains drawn, mailbox gone. A neighbor said she'd moved suddenly, in the middle of the night. She didn't take much, he told me. Just a mattress. That was when I realized it wasn't about the bed at all. It was about what lived inside it. Folklore says cursed objects don't start cursed. They absorb things, fear, desire, grief until they change. That bed had seen everything. Generations of suffering, sickness, childbirth, death. It became the family's altar, and like all altars, it demanded offerings. The Whittakers didn't worship anything you'd recognize. They didn't pray to saints or spirits. Their god was blood itself, the purest kind, the kind that never left the valley. They believed the world outside would poison them, dilute them, erase them. So they turned inward, generation after generation, folding the same blood back into itself. It wasn't ignorance. It was faith. And that's what makes it terrifying. Because once you understand that, the stories make sense. The laughter in the woods, the strange faces in the window, the voices that didn't sound human. They weren't monsters. They were people who forgot how to be anything else. But here's where the story takes a turn no one talks about. Around 1910, a traveling preacher came through the valley. He wrote about it in his journal, which I found in a church archive in Little Rock. He said the Whittakers invited him to stay the night. He described the house as dark and smelling of sickness. He wrote about the children, silent, pale, their eyes reflecting the lamp as though the fire were behind them. Then he mentions the bed. He said they told him it had never been empty since it was built, that someone was always sleeping in it. Even if the house was empty, the bed wasn't. That line stayed with me. The preacher left the next morning and never returned. 3 months later, the church received a parcel from him postmarked from Tennessee. Inside was a page torn from his journal, the rest burned. The last thing written was a single sentence. The bed breathes when no one is near. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed in that valley, protecting your kin? Or would you have walked away knowing your name would die with you? Because maybe that's the real question. Maybe survival isn't always the right choice. When I went back to Widow's Creek myself, the road was gone. Trees had swallowed it. The old bridge had collapsed into the ravine. But after half a day's hike, I found the remains of the Whittaker house. Just a skeleton now, beams like ribs, the roof caved in, the door still hanging by one hinge. And inside, under a sheet of fallen plaster and dirt, the bed. It was exactly where the map said it would be. The wood was black, like it had soaked up everything that had ever happened around it. I brushed the dust away and found carvings. Hundreds of them. Initials, crosses, tally marks. I counted 17 names that matched birth records I'd seen in the county archive. The earliest from 1847. The last from 1983. The air was still thick. It smelled faintly of something sweet and rotten. And then I noticed the mattress. It was newer, not the same one from the photos. Someone had replaced it. Recently. That shouldn't have been possible. The house had been abandoned for decades. I don't remember leaving. 1 minute I was inside. The next I was halfway down the hill, hands shaking, dirt under my nails. When I got back to my car, I realized something. My phone's camera roll had 3 photos I didn't take, all of the bed, and in each one it looked slightly different. The sheets shifted, the shape changed, like someone was lying under them. I deleted them immediately, but the image stayed burned behind my eyes. A few weeks later, I went to the county courthouse to request access to property deeds for Widow's Creek. The clerk looked at me strangely and said, "That land's not public, it's owned." I asked who owned it. She pulled up the record. The name on the file stopped me cold. Ruth Whittaker. Filed less than a year ago. The address listed was blank. Just a P.O. box. That's when I realized the truth. She hadn't moved away. She'd gone back. And if that's true, the bed isn't waiting anymore. It's being used again. I went back one last time. Not to the cabin itself. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line again, but to the valley. The closer I drove, the more the world began to thin. Cell service dropped. The air turned gray, like the color had been drained out of everything. Even the birds went silent. Felt like time didn't flow there. It waited. Widow's Creek wasn't just a place. It was a wound. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, then nothing. I parked and walked. The forest swallowed the light. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground wanted me to stop. I found the old fence line, half buried in moss. Beyond it, I could see the remains of what used to be the Whittaker orchard. Apple trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches fused together like fingers locked in prayer. And then, in the distance, the faint outline of smoke. Someone was there. I stayed low, following the sound of running water until I reached the edge of the creek. Across it stood a new structure, smaller than the old house, built of fresh timber. Not abandoned, not forgotten. It had curtains. A light flickered inside. The bed was back. I could see it through the window, not clearly, but enough. Same frame, same shape, that impossible familiarity. The wood was darker now, the carvings deeper, like someone had traced them over and over with a knife. I remember feeling something between fear and reverence, the way you might feel standing in a church you don't believe in. And then I saw her, Ruth. She was older, or maybe just changed by the light. She stood beside the bed, motionless, her hands resting on the footboard. Her lips were moving, but no sound came through the glass. Then she turned her head, slow, deliberate, and looked straight at me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road. My chest burned, my legs shaking, my mind trying to explain what I'd just seen. But deep down, I already knew. Ruth hadn't just gone back to the valley. She'd become it. She'd answered the call that ran through her blood, the one that started in that bed 170 years ago. Some bloodlines don't die. They retreat. They wait. And maybe that's the true legacy of the Whittakers. Not the inbreeding, not the isolation, but the idea that a family can grow inward until it becomes its own religion. That somewhere out there, in the hidden cracks of this country, there are still people who believe the world outside is poison, who guard what's left of their blood like scripture. When I tried to tell people about it, no one wanted to listen. The sheriff said the property was sealed. The county said no one lived there. But a week later, someone sent me a package with no return address. Inside was a small piece of wood, blackened, with a single carving on it, an R overlapping a W, and it smelled like the cabin. Sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear that same slow rhythm. Creak, pause, creak, like a rocking bed moving on its own. The sound always comes from below me, as if the floor remembers. It's strange what this country hides. Everyone talks about the cities, the wars, the scandals. But the real history, the forgotten history, lives in the hollers, the swamps, the dry plains. Families that sealed themselves away from the rest of us. Names that never made it into textbooks. Bloodlines that twisted themselves into something unrecognizable. You can feel them when you drive through the back roads at night. Those houses with a single light burning in the window, miles from the next neighbor. You wonder who lives there. You tell yourself they're normal people. But what if they're not? What if they're the echoes of bloodlines that never came down from the hills? What if the Whittakers were never the only ones? America has always had places it doesn't want to look at. Hollows where the soil is too red, where the names on the graves are all the same, where a family's story loops in on itself until it becomes a secret language. You can call it poverty or madness or sin, but it's something older than all of that. Something that was here before the maps, before the roads, before the idea of progress. The Whittakers were just one version of it. One bed, 7 generations. A family that turned isolation into faith. And a curse that didn't end with them, it adapted. Because the longer I've looked into this, the more I've found traces of that same pattern elsewhere. Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee. The same names, the same signs. Always a bed. Always a matriarch who stays behind when the rest leave. Always the same word written on the doorframe. Pure. Maybe that's what frightens me most. The idea that what we call inbreeding wasn't just accident or ignorance, but ritual. That purity to them wasn't physical. It was spiritual. A way of keeping the outside world from diluting whatever they believed they were protecting. I sometimes wonder what's left of them now. If Ruth is still alive. If that new house is still standing in the valley, or if the forest has reclaimed it again, folding it back into the silence. But I can tell you this, the bed is still there. It always will be. Because the Whittakers didn't build it to sleep in. They built it to stay in. It was their cradle, their altar, their coffin. And maybe that's why it still breathes. Maybe it's waiting for someone new to lie down. Someone who shares the blood, even if they don't know it yet. And if you ever find yourself lost in those mountains, far from the nearest town, and you come across a clearing with no birds and no sound, don't go inside. Don't look through the window. Don't touch the bed. Because if you do, you might realize too late that the blood doesn't just run through families. It runs through the land. And some parts of America never let go. Not of their dead. Not of their secrets. And not of the ones who come looking for them. So if you hear that slow, rhythmic creak in the dark, don't wonder what's making it. Just keep walking. And never look back.